With just a few more races remaining for the end of the year, the 2021 Formula One Championship is really starting to heat up, with Lewis Hamilton leading Max Verstappen by only 2 points. And as you can imagine, an exciting season brings with it more than a few opinions. So should McLaren have put their foot down in Sochi, and what does leaving track space even mean in today's racing? Well, stay tuned to find out. Number 1, should McLaren have overruled Lando Norris in Russia? First up on the agenda is an opinion that has been floating around ever since the exciting finish of the Russian Grand Prix last weekend. For those of you who missed out on the race, Verstappen started from the final position on the grid, taking a grand total of 2 penalties in an effort to secure himself a fresh engine. Hamilton, on the other hand, qualified in 4th position after having a bit of a run-in with the pit wall. In other words, it looked like the fight between Hamilton and Verstappen was going to have to wait for the next race. And so everyone turned their attention toward Lando Norris of McLaren, who had once more outperformed his teammate by securing himself pole position in Sochi, and since the British-Belgium racer has never won a Formula One event before, fans knew that this could be his chance to make history for the first time. So, you can imagine the intense pressure that Norris was carrying into the race. Things got even worse for the driver when the Russian weather decided to throw him for a loop, setting a strange set of events into motion, and still have fans scratching their heads to this day. So, what actually happened in Sochi? Despite everything being against him though, which included a defending champion on his tail, Norris drove an incredible race. His fans roared in excitement as the final couple of laps started to tick down, but then the track started to get a bit too wet for everyone's liking. The majority of drivers made the decision to pit, fearing that the surface would become far too slippery for dry tires to handle. But unfortunately for Norris, the decision to stay out on the track haunted him to the very end of the race. And as it turns out, the decision to stay on dry tires was actually his. He wasn't the only one though. Lewis Hamilton could be heard complaining about the decision to put on the team radio, stating that he could handle the wetness for the rest of the race. Mercedes did eventually overrule his decision and demand that he pit for some intermediate tires though, which was essentially the decision that led to him winning the race. McLaren, on the other hand, didn't follow the example of their parent team, allowing Norris to stay on dry tires as the track continued to get wetter. Not exactly the best of decisions. Was it Norris's attitude or inexperience that led to this decision? Fans who watched the race in Sochi know precisely what happened next. The drivers who had decided to change to intermediates found themselves in the correct lane, overtaking those who were struggling to deal with the slippery nature of the track. And just like that, Norris began to fall, slipping from 1st to 7th in a matter of minutes before finally pitting for intermediates. Suffice to say, it was Lando's decision to stay out on the track that truly got in the way of him winning his first race. But funnily enough, it wasn't him who bore the brunt of the fan backlash. It was actually his team, McLaren, who were slashed at by the media, asking why they hadn't decided to overrule Norris's decision like Mercedes had done to Lewis on the day. This is in spite of Norris telling his race engineer, Will Joseph, to shut up after being warned of a particularly slippery part of the track where cars were sliding off. The only other communication between Norris and his race engineer was a question posed to the racer, asking what he thought about intermediates. And as any winner would, Lando just shouted no and carried on concentrating on the race ahead of him. So, why was McLaren blamed for this decision? What is meant by the giving of the track space in Formula One? Don't go anywhere because we're getting into it right now. So then, why was McLaren blamed for this decision? Clearly sounds like it was Norris's fault, right? So why are fans so upset with McLaren then? Well, as it turns out, it's essentially a team decision as to when a driver needs to pit. Remember, the driver of a Formula One car knows precisely what is going on when it comes to the feeling of a track and the performance of a car. Regardless of the statistics that the team is picking up on race day, it's the word of a driver that has to take precedence when it comes to the decisions involving those aspects. The same cannot, however, be said about strategic decisions such as when to actually pit due to weather conditions. The team team has all the information necessary to make a correct decision. This includes everything from which other drivers are pitting to what the weather forecast is looking like for the next few minutes. And this is the type of information that the team didn't end up giving Norris in the first place. In fact, McLaren didn't even suggest to him that intermediates were the best option for the race ahead. Instead, they had the race engineer ask what Norris thought of the strategy. It all comes down to a lack of information. This meant that Norris was being left with a decision that had to be made with a general lack of information at his fingertips. Of course, fans were upset by the way that McLaren had handled things. Honestly, it doesn't even matter if Norris had been given this information and still made the decision to stay out on dry tires. Formula One is a team sport after all, with the team having to actively make decisions that a driver has to follow. We saw this when Lewis, too, felt like he could control the car without the help of intermediates. But despite the fact that the Brit is the defending champion, Mercedes decided to overrule his decision and bring him in. McLaren team boss Andreas Seidel has gone on to admit that the wrong decision was made back in Sochi, siding with Norris by saying, "The driver has very limited information. That's why he can only feed back what he feels on the track." Which he did. But at the same time, if we had firm information that it simply doesn't make sense to stay out, we always have the possibility to overrule. And that's exactly what we need to analyze as a team. In other words, McLaren should have definitely overruled Lando in Sochi. Number 2. What is meant by the giving of track space in Formula One? Another question that Formula One fans have been asking over the last few months is what is actually meant by giving a driver space when it comes to racing. In the last couple of races, there have been a few incidents that have called the question into existence, both of which have resulted in Hamilton and Verstappen fans facing off against one another in a battle of words. The first incident took place at Silverstone, where Lewis crashed into Max by taking a corner too quickly. This resulted in the technical understeering of the Mercedes, which went on to push Verstappen off the track and cause him to collide with the barrier in front of him. And while the Dutchman was being airlifted to hospital, his rival was speeding across the track to secure himself a victory. Verstappen fans threw their hands up in disbelief, knowing full well that Hamilton had given him no space to continue racing safely. But then came the Italian Grand Prix, which saw Max Verstappen ending up behind Lewis after a poor pit lane performance from his team, Red Bull Racing. Clearly frustrated by the turn of events, Max sped up behind Hamilton and tried to maneuver himself into a gap which didn't exist, and just like that, both Max and Lewis were out of the race. The real answer is far more vague than you might expect. Once more, the question of space came up, with some experts siding with Max while others took the position of Hamilton by stating that Max came out of nowhere and collided with the defending champion. And when asked in a post-race interview what Verstappen thought of the collision, the Dutchman clearly was quick to mention that it was all the result of Hamilton not giving him any space to race. But what is actually meant by the giving of space in Formula One? Does it mean that drivers have to move out of one another's way, giving up their hard-earned positions? Well, according to FIA, the situation as it currently stands is pretty vague. All drivers are required to do is ensure the safety of one another on the track, which is why Lewis and Max were penalized when they got in each other's way. Whether this rule needs to be revised or made clearer is a different question though, one that Formula One fans have been asking to be answered for the past few years already. And there you have it, everything you need to know about the fanatical Formula One opinions of the day. What do you think of McLaren's decision to not demand a pit stop though, and whose side are you on when it comes to the fight between Max and Lewis? Be sure to let us know in the comment section down below.